So my name is Jolien Chesworth and I work for the Wildlife Trusts as the South East Marine Conservation Manager. So I focus purely on carrying out survey work in and around our marine environment to try and increase our knowledge of the seas, which in some respects is several decades behind our knowledge of the terrestrial environment, simply because it's quite difficult to access. And in order to try and get around some of those access issues, we've started to use some novel and quite technological pieces of equipment to improve our understanding of the different habitats and species which live in and around the shores in our area. In 2009, we started a study to look specifically at our local harbour seal population. Quite a lot of people would think that perhaps, living around the Solent, very busy areas, a lot of commercial shipping, naval activity, recreational activities, that perhaps some of these big charismatic species like seals would avoid the area. But in fact, we do have a quite a successful, albeit fairly small population of harbour seals. Now, harbour seals are sometimes called common seals, but it's a bit of a misnomer because they're not as common as they used to be. It's now thought that in some areas, particularly off the coast of Scotland, harbour seal populations have declined by about 50%, which is quite worrying because the number of harbour seals in the UK accounts for about 35% of the global population. So what happens to the harbour seals in the UK has implications for the survival of the species across the whole world. So it's very important that we monitor our harbour seal populations and understand whether they're increasing, decreasing, and why those changes might possibly be happening. So because of this, we carried out a survey of our local population of harbour seals with the basic aim really of trying to understand exactly how many we've got, because so little is known. We didn't even know how many individuals are in the population, where their important resting sites are, which are called haul-out sites, and where their important feeding and breeding sites are. Now, to try and sort of improve our knowledge of these seals, we employed a variety of techniques. Some of them are fairly sort of traditional, old-fashioned techniques, which often are the best. The simplest things tend to go wrong the least. So that included things like basically just visiting the areas where we know that they rest. So at low tide, the seals will normally rest on mud banks, and they'll sort of relax, conserve energy, bask in the sunlight when it's sunny. And then when the tide comes up, it will float the seals off the mud, and that's when they go off to feed. So if you know where their main resting sites are, you can just simply go there by boat, or sometimes even from the shore, and you can just count them. And that can give you actually a very good idea of how many individuals there are within the population. And from that work, we've been able to estimate that there's probably somewhere in the region of around 20 to 25 harbour seals living in and around the Solent, and 1 or 2 grey seals as well, which is a different population. Slightly more advanced, we've also been using photo identification. Now the markings on seal fur are unique to each individual. They're a bit like our fingerprints. So if you can get close enough to take good images of these seals, you can actually work out what the key sort of identifying markings are on the seal sort of head and neck area. And then if you carry out repeat surveys, you can find out whether those individuals are still there, whether they've perhaps moved out of the area, or whether we've got new seals which have come into the area from neighbouring populations, perhaps even in France or in Kent, because we think that these seals do sometimes move around fairly widely. But perhaps the most sort of up-to-date technological way that we've been monitoring seals is through the use of one of these. And this is a tag, basically. It's called a GSM tag. And GSM basically means that it runs on the mobile phone network. So it's essentially an advanced mobile phone. And if you look inside of it, you can see that actually there's a Vodafone SIM card in here, and they all run on the Vodafone network. So it's actually their mobile phones. On here we have an aerial, and that aerial helps to transmit information that the tag has gathered back to the receiving station, which in this case is the Sea Mammal Research Unit up at St Andrews University in Scotland, who manufacture these tags. And it also downloads GPS data, so that's global positioning data, and it's effectively just the location of where the seal happens to be at any particular moment. And it's extremely sort of high resolution location information, so wherever the seal goes we can track them with this tag. It takes the position and then it sends it back to the receiving station, and we can follow the seals around and find out where they've been going to feed and where they're going to rest. But as well as location information, these tags also are able to gather information on their diving behaviour. So it can tell whether the seal is underwater, and it can find out how deep that seal is, and also how long the seal is underwater as well. And this is particularly important because it means that we can actually identify foraging sites. From a conservation point of view, protecting a species is all very well, but really to protect that species you actually need to protect the site or the habitat that that species relies upon. So finding out where its main feeding areas is very important, because it means if we can protect those seals will always have somewhere to go and feed. So that's the tags there. The way that we catch the seals to attach the tags is relatively simple sounding, but actually in terms of actually carrying it out, it's rather more complicated. Essentially we employ two boats. One boat which is quite fast and it has a net on the back, and another boat which is a little bit slow and just comes along behind. The fast boat will approach the seals when they're resting. It will drop one end of the net in the water, and then it will encircle the seals whilst they're still on the land, and then the second boat will come and pick that dropped end up, and both ends will be taken into the shore, and you effectively pull the net in, hopefully with some seals in the bottom of it, and then once you have them on shore you can work with them and attach the tags to them. Catching seals is quite a sort of a dangerous sort of activity really. They're very big, very powerful animals. They can weigh up to 100 kilos or 15-16 stone, and they have very large teeth as well, so you need to make sure you keep the fingers out of their mouths. So once we have them in a net, we bring them on shore, and all has to be done under anaesthetic so that the seals don't get too stressed. And the Sea Mammal Research Unit from St Andrews University came down to help us catch the seals, because they have a lot of experience and they're licensed to do so, which is very important, because you do need to be careful with these animals for your sake as well as their own. So once the seal has been anaesthetised, we can attach the tag using an epoxy resin, which is just a type of glue. And once it's positioned on there, the seal then wakes up after about 10 to 15 minutes, none the worse for wear, jumps back in the water, and off it swims. And then from that moment we can actually follow the seal wherever it's going, whether it's resting or whether it's feeding. The data that we found from these tags has been really sort of interesting and useful. We had no idea where these seals actually went. It's very difficult to actually follow and monitor these quite mobile animals. Once the tide comes up, they're under the water and off they go, and it's impossible to keep track of them. However, the tags have shown that they do have very specific foraging areas in some instances. For instance, there's an area off Selsey Bill where they'll regularly frequent, and they'll go and feed there. There's also areas within all the harbours, so Chichester Harbour, Langstone Harbour and Portsmouth Harbour as well, where they'll regularly feed. Some of the seals went over to the Isle of Wight and fed in the channels around Bembridge Harbour and the sandy seabed around Ryde. And one of the seals, perhaps the most adventurous, actually went on a weekend trip to Worthing, and during that period he spent about 2 to 3 days. He slept at sea, and we can tell that kind of information from the tag, and he was diving down to depths of around 60 metres, so you know, big dives, and in fact the longest dive that we recorded was about 25 minutes, although the average tends to be a little bit shorter at around 4 to 5 minutes. So from the work that we've been able to carry out, we now have been able to highlight probably around 15 really important foraging grounds, and that kind of information we are now using through various government projects to try and get these areas protected through the designation of marine conservation zones, which the UK is now looking to set up all around the country. And we're hoping that the information that the tags have revealed will actually then benefit the population by having some of these important sites actually protected, so their seals can continue to thrive in future. The population that we have in the Solent is probably only around 20 to 25 seals, so it's quite small, so it doesn't take huge amounts of food to keep that population healthy. But when we actually caught the seals, in order to attach the tags, we were able to check their general body condition, and they were very large seals for their species, and they seem to be in very good shape as well, which would suggest that there's actually, you know, plentiful supplies of food for them. And being a small population, that's perhaps not surprising. It doesn't appear that some of the national declines in harbour seal numbers are seen in our local population, and that may well be because, it is fairly isolated. The nearest populations, 100 kilometres away, either in Kent or even further across on the north coast of France. So they're relatively isolated. They're relatively self-contained. They don't seem to travel very much outside of the eastern Solent, in fact. And that probably means that they're more or less kind of left on their own. If there's any disease which is causing declines around the country, they'll hopefully be fairly well isolated from that, because those migratory pathways perhaps won't exist. Having said that, we do know that seals do move around a little bit, and we do have information to suggest that a seal that was tagged in France came over to the Isle of Wight and then swam along the coast of Sussex towards Kent. But that seems to be perhaps more of an exception than the norm. So it does seem that the information that we've got suggests that our populations are not decreasing in our local area. And we do normally see 1 to 2 pups per year, which suggests that they are breeding in this area. And the data that we have been able to collect from wardens who often see these seals and take sightings would suggest that probably in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, the seals have grown from probably only about 3 or 4 in number up to the sort of 20-25 that we're seeing today. So it's a small population, but it does seem to be growing fairly steadily, which would indicate that there's actually a reasonable amount of food for them to catch and eat there. And they're haul-out sites as well. Although it's a busy area, they've chosen more quiet sections of the harbour where disturbance is perhaps likely not to be too great. So at least when they're resting, which is when they're most vulnerable, they can at least relax a bit. As part of the project, we've actually been asking members of the public to send in sightings to us, because people often walk along the beach, take their dogs for a walk. Obviously there's an awful lot of sailing and boating goes on in these areas, and it's quite likely that if you spend a lot of time walking around this area, around the coast, you'll actually see a seal. And that kind of information is really important for us, because although the tags are great, they only last for about 6 months, after which they drop off when the seal molts. After that, we don't really know what the seals are up to. So the more sightings we get from members of the public, the better, because it means that we can continue to effectively track these seals and find out where they're going and where they're regularly seen. And on our website we have a recording form, so that members of the public who have seen a seal can simply fill in a little bit of information about what they saw and where they saw it, and then they can send that off to us, and that then will go into our database along with our tag information to help us work out a little bit better where these seals are going and what they're up to.